Alright, so this video is sure to be a fun and exciting adventure because I'm going to be hopefully putting to rest one of the biggest stumbling blocks and one of the more annoying things that I see and perceive out, in comments and in conversations and in talking to people. And that is this whole idea of, transcending the ego, going beyond the ego, getting beyond it, etc. I'm sure if you're at all familiar with these kinds of things, you've heard this whole line of thinking, you've heard this conversation, and it might even be something you have struggled with or are struggling with or may in the future. So what I'm going to do in this video is demonstrate 2 points. First, the ego doesn't really exist. It never has, so in that sense, it's senseless and useless to try to fight against it and get rid of it because it never existed in the first place. Secondly, usually when people are engaging in this sort of line of thinking or accusing others of these kinds of things, it's because they really haven't actually seen through it and they just haven't reached that level of understanding, and their energy that they're putting off about it is just proving that they haven't really gotten it yet. So hopefully this video will help us get it and really evolve the conversation a little bit. So first, what does the word ego mean? Well, it comes from the Latin word I, which we use as self or identity, right? So there's that. Secondly, we tend to associate these words with the word person or our persona because these are one and the same thing. But what persona means is actually character or role or mask through which sound is passed through. Because it has its roots in an ancient Greek word, which you can look up on Wikipedia if you want to learn more about it. But that's what these words mean. It has nothing to do with an independent entity separate from everything else that needs to be transcended or evolved. It's simply a role. It's simply a symbolic convenience. So the ego really doesn't exist as an independent, separate object of action and influence. Second, it's really just a symbolic way of distinguishing between, over here and over here and over there and over here, etc. It's just like north, south, east, west. Those directions don't actually exist, meaning you don't go out in nature and say, oh my god, I found north, here it is, here's north. No, it's just a symbolic convenience so that you and I can communicate symbolically. But that doesn't mean it's existentially real. It doesn't mean that we need to transcend it or go beyond it, because that would just be silly, because we're the ones that made it up in the first place. So along with that, this whole idea of ego and self and other, it's just embedded in our language. Because we have this subject, object, noun, verb built into our language. So it's inherently contradictory to try to say, oh, life, I'm beyond my ego. You obviously aren't. Because we're still using language. And language has subject-object embedded into it, which subject, object, subject, object, object, subject, however you verbalize it, and then noun and verb. So self and other, I, ego, it's all embedded in language, and that's really where it has its roots. So if you really want to transcend your ego, you should probably never use language or talk or think ever again, because anytime you think, automatically it's implied. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily real. It doesn't mean you have to spend your life struggling against it. It doesn't mean you have to attack other people out of insecurity or out of you don't like the way you feel. So there's no escaping it, there's no going beyond it, and what we need to do is understand the limits of language. And like most tools, it has uses, it has misuses, it has strengths, it has weaknesses, it has, attributes, and it has flaws, like everything else, like all other tools. So we need to realize that this is the nature of the game that we're playing, and see past it and see through it and drop this whole struggle dialogue that people seem to get into. So when people talk about, oh, you obviously haven't seen past your ego yet, you obviously haven't done this or that or put in enough time, or you're still trapped in your intellect or your mind. Number one, that comment's coming from their intellect and mind. Number two, usually what that means is you said or did something which I don't like, or I don't like the way it made me feel, so out of spiritual pride and spiritual arrogance and spiritual superiority, I'm going to say this to you. When in reality, it's an inherently meaningless and senseless, useless thing to say, because it doesn't have any meaning, because you've already seen that this idea of the ego, which this person's proposing to be some sort of enemy or proposing something that's been transcended, doesn't even exist in the first place. So congratulations for transcending something that was never there to begin with, because it was just a symbolic interpretation that we made up to distinguish self and I, meaning self and other, etc., or the character role we're playing or the mask through which sound is passing. So there's that. So basically, usually when people are saying these kinds of things or accusing you of, oh, dude, you're stuck in your ego, it's usually just spiritual pride and arrogance. Plain and simple, I should say. So to accuse another person of being their ego or that whole line of thinking just shows that the person who's speaking that rhetoric really hasn't figured it out, really hasn't seen through it, really hasn't realized that it's actually just a symbolic and linguistic creation that has no real existential reality. Secondly, the more you talk of it, the more you struggle against it, the more you try to run away from it or let it go or get out of it, the more you just imply it and strengthen it. It's like Alan Watts used to say, how can you lift yourself up by your own bootstraps? Try it one day. Sit down on the floor, put your boots on, and try to lift your body up by your own bootstraps. Just pointing that out there. So the main point, the conclusion of this, is that the problem isn't the language necessarily, because we need to communicate, because like I said before, language is a tool. Like all tools, has uses, misuses, pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses. So we have to realize this, realize that's what we're doing, be aware of that, be enlightened or be awakened to that, and see that, and then drop this whole argument or, oh, I gotta meditate so I can get outside my ego. Now, if you feel disconnected, if you feel, separate from the world, if you feel isolated, you feel connected, you feel cut off, you feel all these things, it's really just muscular tension, muscular strain, and some sort of misprogramming in the mind. It's not this ego, it's something you have to transcend or go beyond, because the ego never existed in the first place. The last point I'm going to make is when an organ is working properly, we're unaware of it. Meaning, when your eyes are working properly, you're not aware of them, unless you have cataracts, which is your eyes not working properly. And again, when you're listening, when you're hearing things, you usually don't hear your ears unless something is wrong, meaning your ears are ringing. And usually when you're thinking clearly, your brain isn't getting in its own way, and it's not stumbling and running around in circles. So the point of that is, when an organ is working properly, you're unaware of it. So if you're engaging in this battle of ego, you're engaging in transcending the ego or saying your ego is this or my ego is that, or just stuck in that whole conversation, probably means something isn't firing properly. You need to examine the concepts that I have laid out in this video first and foremost, meaning the ego means I, self, identity. Second, persona, the person, is a mask, a character, or role that we play, and it's a mask through which sound is passed. So hopefully that's been helpful. If you have any questions or comments, I look forward to hearing them, and post them below, and I will talk to you soon.